Kurt Dagel, and I'll give you a little bit of context of where I come from and how I got to where I am today. About 5 years ago, I said I wasn't going to do any more of these because I felt that I needed to be in a certain utopia of type of farm. And if I was speaking to groups of people like you, maybe I felt like a hypocrite or something, because everybody's farm doesn't fit into a perfect box. But nevertheless, these guys are a good group to work with, and felt compelled when they asked me to do a breakout. So anyway, I came about agronomy kind of in a long fashion. I always had aspirations to actually be a waterfowl biologist, and so my journey was kind of unconventional to get into cropping systems. But as Ray showed us yesterday, you kind of have that, what he's describing as the butterfly effect, but I like to call it is you run into certain mentors along the way and steer you in different directions. So I shifted gears like most people if they go to college, and pursued a degree in botany. And I guess I hold the coveted title at South Dakota State University as the last botany major with that degree. So I guess that's kind of a nice little honor. But anyway, went on to work for the U.S. Forest Service and did survey work for pre-harvest timber surveys. They're mandated to do those sorts of things. But when I spent time in the mountains, I was like, I kind of want to get back to the prairie. I miss like the seasonal change of, the landscape, because in the forest it does change, but it just wasn't quite me. So I set a course to go back, and I liked agriculture. I grew up, both sides of my family were from farms or ranches, but being the son of son number 5, there was no hope for my dad to make a living on a farm, so we all went and did different pursuits. So when I went back to South Dakota State to work on a master's degree, I ended up at the ARS lab where I did some part-time work, and an entomologist needed a technician, and so I applied for that position, and who you know helps you, and I got that job. And then through that transition, ran into the new agronomists at the lab, and we did kind of a swap for technicians, and so I started working with her, and then over time I worked on my master's in agronomy under my supervisor, Shannon Osborne. And so her, along with other people we worked with in our early cover crop, no-till systems, different kinds of things that 25 years ago weren't common like they are now. But some of my mentors were Randy Anderson, who was a weed ecologist, and Tom Schumacher, who was a soil physicist, and Dan Forgey from Cronin Farms, and Dwayne Beck. Those are the kind of guys I got to kick around with. And so that kind of dates me now. But I spent 20 years in early cover crop no-till research, helped support that, and got to learn a different way of looking at things than if I had kind of come up the conventional path of agronomy. So it's more ecological in that soil, landscape type of interaction. So let's see. So today, that's kind of going to be the focus. I want to focus on basic understanding. I mean, I came to this because it's kind of a spiritual virtue, but also we're at a maximal time of different types of things that we can apply to our farms, and what we might get out of them, what we need out of them. And so there's a lot of confusion, and what really matters is just basic cultural things. And so I'm not going to really bring anything earth-shattering, but want to show you some of the methodologies or thought processes that you guys probably already do, but I think are the key things that we always have to understand the most. So, prudence, wisdom, knowledge, understanding, and of course, the longer you do something, you hopefully gain good judgment. And agronomy and the age of inputs is basically, it's like we're trying to always disassociate ourselves from the landscape. So we're constantly looking for comforts that the landscape imposes on us when we are always reaching for inputs, and natural systems get tired of that after a while, and it's like the willow branch, it's lean it over but it snaps back up and gets you right in the face. And so when we impose too many things on the landscape, they just don't function right anymore. And so these are the things that I like to focus on. Can everybody hear me? Or I gotta keep the mic really close. So these are the things that I like to focus on. Time and space at your growing season. So we just heard a different context. The boot heel of Missouri is a different context. Our speakers yesterday, different context. But nevertheless, all the same things that are free to us, and you guys have heard this many times over, but this is how my agronomy approach is focused, is how can we maximize that growing season? We have free solar energy, soil is an inherent resource, and then what's our rainfall look like? So the one I want to focus on the most is intensification. And this kind of stimulates from always rubbing shoulders with somebody like Dwayne Beck. But when you think of intensification, it has to do with the water cycle for me, is how do we manage our water cycle? And if you ever wondered what 200 bushel acre oats look like, that's how they look like, sideways. So, of course, being analytical somewhat, you gotta have mental models to follow. So just bear with me. These get to be kind of busy, but I wanted to illustrate the point of where we get into trouble if we go to all the flashy inputs and we forget about the water cycle and how that really drives everything. So let's see if I can get off course here. So now I'm going to back up because I already skipped over things. So flash forward. So since I gotten out of research, I wanted a new challenge. I've been with Olsen Custom Farms for 8 years, and I've valued the opportunity because when you live in the research world, obviously it's a different context. So now it's like, will these things hold up in the real world? And now I have more data than the last time I spoke to a group about 5 or 6 years ago in Wilmer. And I think we're doing okay, all right? And this is one way we're going to look at intensification. So in the white box, you can see our track record of our broadacre farm getting most of the crop planted by May 10th. In our minds, anything after May 10th isn't going to probably have as good a chance of success. Now we know there's always anomalies to that, but it's just the reality of where we live and how things roll and potential. And so if we look at like 2017 in that time period, and I'm just using an average rainfall that's in the middle of our 40-acre swath of farms that we have influence over, and we got nearly 12 inches of rain. 2018, that one was a bruiser in the fall. That was get every big tire you could to get the crop out. But then what I want you to focus on is when you look at those two, what's our chances that we got our crop planted by, a majority of our crop planted by May 10th? Pretty poor. And then if you look at 2019, where it was a total train wreck, you stack the fall of 2018 with the spring of 2019, and we're drowning, so to speak. We've hit our average for the growing season in those two time periods. And then, of course, we didn't get much crop planted as a result. Now, 2022, we didn't do very well either, even though our previous 2021 precipitation wasn't too bad, but that's too much when you're looking at April 20th to May 10th as your go time window. And so if we look at 2021 fall, yeah, there's again, we're too high in precipitation there. And then 2024, this is where a lot of people in this state just had an absolute struggle bus. And we actually came out of fall 2023 okay, but then when you stack that much precipitation into that early spring window, we don't do very good. We did okay because we've intensified, and the first big rain event we were ahead of. The second ones were we got caught and didn't get all the corn in. But what I'm trying to make a point here is that most silty clay loams in this region only can store about 12 inches, 10 to 12 inches of usable water in the upper, the top 3 feet, 60 centimeters. And basically we have to be intense enough in our cropping system that we're coming into a spring in almost a drought situation. If you look at our 100%ers, we have a dry fall period followed by a moderate spring period. So naturally, we're poised for success. Now, 2024 fall, we've picked up a little bit more rain, but if you were a betting man, we're looking pretty good for 100% by May 10th if we don't get that untimely event in our critical window. And so when you talk about intensification, we have to match our water use. Our cropping system has to match what our rainfall is. And so that's why cover crops are so essential. We're not going to till it away. We're not going to tile it away, because the tillage, really 2 tillages, or you're only going to lose about 1.5 inches to a tillage operation. Bare soils, in both those shoulder seasons, you don't get a lot of evaporation. And so that's not going to do it. Now, tile, depending on your depth of water table, that's a tool, but your dispersed layer, depending on the gravity of tillage that you do, that's going to create a tortuous layer that's actually going to be the primary regulator to how fast the water gets to the tile. So really it comes back to intensification. You have to come into the season somewhat empty, so you can take in that spring rain so you're not getting train wrecked to not get your crop planted. And if we think about that, we can be dry in the spring. We only need 5 inches of plant available moisture till the 1st of July. We can do it. We don't need to have too much moisture. So when people say, oh, that cover crop's gonna use too much water, no. I'm gonna be able to store water. That's what I wanna do. Now we have to understand what we're doing with the cover crop, but that's the key. You gotta create the condition like the fall of 20, the fall of 2019. So in 2020 we did all right, even though 2019 was really wet because we were intensive. A lot of land got planted to covers. We still used the water, but we had the right April, June to back that up. So that ended up being a successful spring for us. And so I'm spending most of my time just on this slide because it's so important to be intensive in our water use. If you look at any kind of prairie system, water doesn't sit there. It infiltrates to a deep depth at a rather fairly good pace, other than our wetland soils. So we have to mimic that. If we don't have this right, and so as soon as you start so coming back to that prudence, as soon as you start laying off the tillage intensity, and 25 years ago when I was in the rookie cover crop era, this was always the argument. It was like, it's too wet, you can't do anything, or when you stop tilling. But then cover crops were that way you broke through that, because that re-upped your intensity to match your water capturing capacity, plus dealing with that lack of evaporation. Now everything's going through the plant as transpiration. So this is the single biggest thing to understand is intensity. We have to be somewhat on the dry side to make things function correctly. And if you think about prairie landscapes, they like to be on the dry side. So 2025, based on our current scenario, as long as we don't get 15 in that April, June, we'll probably be all right. But we want to come in now. A lot of people said it was too dry to seed cover crops this fall, and they didn't plant them, or if they did, they just emerged now. So if we stay in a fairly deficit situation, what's the prudent thing we're going to do? We're going to probably terminate immediately. But if we get into 2024 scenario, now we got the living pattern tile there, and we're going to be good because we're going to have bearing strength and shear strength on our field, and we'll be able to deal with 15.26. And the data backs you up. This isn't necessarily ours, but our yield trends follow this, but this is real data that early planting matters because you're maximizing your interception of solar energy. So any input you can purchase can't get you these kinds of transformative gains. So just understanding your water cycle by intensification is a huge factor. Just one more model to drive this home is if we just break it down into simple efficiencies. Just go through it here. But when you come into a season on the drier side, you can see Oak Lake and the Beersford location. This is just their county average corn yield based on against their growing season precipitation. And so you get way more bushels per inch of captured rainfall. But if we look at Redwood County, yeah, average is a lot more bushels, but your efficiency goes way down because your tank's always too full of water. So your root zone isn't able to function correctly because you've got too much water, so you're not getting high, as Kemp talks about, you're not getting max photosynthesis because your root respiration is always suppressed because your tank's too full of water, so to speak. Whereas if we look at Gettysburg, where it's a totally different type of scenario, they want to maintain surface residue. They'll use cover crops, but they're typically in a scenario what we've seen this past fall, where it's like, it's a little dry. We got enough surface residue that's non-living. We need to capture snow to get our tank full, whereas here, we got to have living residue, get our tank empty so we can take in that big spring surge that we can get. And so they're actually can run a pretty equivalent efficiency, but they're not working with as many total inches of rain. Plus they're warmer, so they have more evaporative demands. But their efficiency is growing, and thus why along the Missouri River, they can grow corn quite successfully because they've learned how to manage intensification in their context. But over here, we haven't got it figured out yet because for the amount of inches we get, Redwood County should be probably like 245, 250. And a lot of farms do that, but not at a county or landscape era. And yesterday, listening to Zach's talk, and he showed an aerial image of his county, Winnebago County in Iowa, and it matches what this is trying to describe. It's like all the ponding and everything. It's like one farm can be doing the right thing, but if all your neighbors are still not very efficient water users, you still feel that effect. Whereas like in Gettysburg, the county is like 95% no disturbance. It's one of the highest counties in the whole US. And so everybody's kind of buffered equally. Whereas here, if you're the only one kind of trying to be intense to manage your water correctly, you still might not look very good because you're dealing with other people's inefficiencies. And just to point out, like Beersford was extremely dry. They're typically a high yield, longer growing season than Redwood County. So they came into that spring super dry, always running at a deficit, but look at their efficiency in 2020. Didn't have as many bushels, but their efficiency was really good. All right. So that's the take-home message. We have room to grow in how we efficiently use our water. And yeah, just again, it's like a lot of big gradient and differences, but how you capture and push it through a plant or store it is really what the outcome is going to look like. Again, just to summarize that. And again, we see this over and over in this region. This is a fragile system. This is how our springs, if we're too full in the spring, this is what we get into trouble with. And then this is why our efficiency of growing whatever it is we grow goes down. And I just thought this was an interesting picture. This is one of our cornfields, but it's next to, at the time, it's our switchgrass seed production field. And so that had been in place for about 7 years. And you can see the first 30 feet, it was capturing so much water, it buffering the first 30 feet, so you don't have any ponding or water moving into the field that way. It's all coming back this way, and it's right to the line. Then you can see also that when we do a tillage in the spring and we get just trafficable enough to get our equipment across, and it's really heavy, most of it, and you can see the wheels on our DB planters. And if you want to do soil compaction, the spring's when you want to do it, because you have just the right balance of air and water-filled pore space. And that's how you make compaction. It'd been better if this was totally covered in water, because then all the pore spaces are filled with water, and you just squeeze out the water. But in the spring, you're actually compressing the pore spaces tightly together, and they just stick together. And we see this time and time again as the depth wheels and then the planter wheels, they do that surface compaction, and it just creates a path for water to flow, and you get a mess. So if we use our water correctly, as the best to our ability, we can avoid these fragile systems.
What did you think the 30 feet was from? The 30 feet dry area?
That's from our switchgrass seed production field.
Do you think is it downhill to the left? Or is it using the water in the spring?
Yeah, it's capturing it. We could have put 20 inches on that field and you'd hardly see any water run off of that. The only year that really was losing water was the day we seeded it, and literally the day after, so it's super fragile, packed, 30-inch row switchgrass, and we got like a 5-inch gully washer on it, and we created some big rill erosion through it.
Do you see other grass fields not do that?
Yeah, the prairie, it doesn't.
Yeah, I see, my prairies don't use enough water because it's all dead, native granules.
Doesn't use enough water?
Yeah, I would say my wet spot would be not that 30 feet. It would be next to the grass.
Well, there are certain soils that just don't infiltrate water at a high rate, plus your water table's up. So if you don't have artificial drainage, it's just we can go into that. I better keep moving here. So again, we've learned from a lot of people, as you start to do different managements, you can assess those things, whether it's, but the infiltration test that the NRCS and all your soil water people do, that's measuring those water stable aggregates. It's still the #1 way to assess that transition area, the air-soil interface. And if you're doing pretty well there, then you're going to be able to capture and retain a water correctly. And one final note on intensification, driving over here, from what I could see, people's adjustment to intensification based on this past year's growing season is just bury more pipe. But if the top isn't working, it don't matter how much pipe you got under there. It's a tool, but it's a lot cheaper with a live cover. Here I'm just trying to illustrate, yeah, your tile would be at that depth, but again, everything's mediated by the surface. By the time it gets down to your tile, you know, that's a lot of time that goes by. So if your surface infiltration, your primary rooting zone isn't correct, then nothing else is going to work very well. You create that discontinuity between pore space, and it's just going to stop right there at the yellow line. All right, I'm going to move on, hit a couple other things. These never go quite the way I anticipate it. The second thing we're really focusing on at the farm is to try to move towards more internal nutrient cycling. And we've listened to a number of folks talk to that. It was good to have Lance ahead of me, because if you're using Haney's, we're using Haney's. We've taken TND tests. Right now, we use them mostly just as an observation tool. We'd like to use the Haney, or more so just all the nitrogen pool assessment as a true management tool going forward for nitrogen. So again, I won't spend any time on that. Simplified view, that's my agronomy degree on the left, and this is what we really need to think about on the right. So current paradigm, import stuff, but we need to move away from that and think about giving consideration to what resources we already have. So the one thing, we've been growing cover crops after our cereal grains now for 8 cropping seasons. So we consider cover crop biomass on all that first year corn that follows those covers. Oats usually, but it's been spring wheat, a few times been rye. Then we grow cover. So we carefully look at the carbon to nitrogen ratio, and then how we're going to influence that. Here, the neighbor grazed these particular fields, so that's going to influence how we change that carbon to nitrogen ratio, and then what method is how that's going to be influenced. How long does it get to grow? So at first we weren't really aggressive in getting our cover crops seeded, and a day in August is equivalent to a week in September. So now the air seeder is right behind our combines, if at all possible, because one critical rain event in August is the difference between that cover starting early and actually doing something for us if our goal is to capture and cycle more nutrients. Now, if a fall like this where it was really dry and you're planting after soybeans, your expectations of what that's going to do is totally different than what we're trying to do here in August. Here we're actually trying to capture and actually cycle, get more nutrients into the organic form, into the active fraction organic matter, so we don't have to buy fertilizer. How that residue, that cover crop, how that's structured is going to make a big difference. And I learned by observation that if that residue stays upright, Yeah, it just stays there forever. It only is subject to oxidization. And so it's good to, if you don't need snow capture, then it's better to get that residue somewhat in contact with the soil at some point in time. And then for us, we're not inherently, we're not a no-till farm. We manage some fields no-till or low disturbance. But if we do a disturbance on our cover crops, research has shown that our curve, our demand curve, or how the nutrients are released is going to be a lot quicker than if you're going to just wait for cycling from static, if it's standing upright, or just normal decomp if you just are in a no-till system. But now there's other ways we can trick the system, whether it's soil primers or inoculants or different types of grazing or compost extracts. Here was one of our early lessons. I should have knew this before we even did it, but when your planter technology isn't caught up to with what you want to do, so when you don't have row by row residue manager control, and it's only section by section, you don't deal with those high carbon areas, because that's where your windrows were the previous summer. Then you see some of those problems. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is our carbon to nitrogen ratio on a lot of our covers. We try to strive for 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen or less. So we do get all of that cycled in the next year's corn crop. If we get too high, then obviously you're not getting good turnover, and it can create some mechanical issues, but it's mainly we want to be able to count on those nutrients getting cycled. That means microbial turnover. Here's just another example where we had the covers grazed, and actually the cattle prefer the high carbon strips first because there's more grasses from the volunteer spring wheat, but then later they move to the other diverse part of the mix that's low carbon. But that can create some influence the next year too. So just how you manage what your cover crop structure and that carbon to nitrogen ratio and the physical manipulation of it, whether it's biological or mechanical, is going to make a difference on how that is released, so to speak, over the next several years. Just an example. So we take into account our cover crop biomass, and that looks at that organic pool of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. We look at the total nutrient digest, if we have one for the field, and say, oh, we got a pretty big bank account. So if we're on the fence, then we don't do any phosphorus, and we don't use any in-furrow product, fertilizer anymore, because we have high-speed planters, and it just doesn't work logistically. So we just rely on a microbial inoculant, which happens to be from a company of a guy that spoke yesterday. And it works pretty good, although we've had to modify it with high-speed planter. Works great in air seeders. We treat all our soybeans with a microbial inoculant, all our oats. And we haven't had any issues because we're not inhibiting that mycorrhiza colonization on our seedlings, whether it's oats, corn, soybeans. And then, yeah, we just look at that cycling of those residues. And so a lot of by doing this, we abandon any kind of dry external fertilizer to our soybean acres. We're totally comfortable with just in-season fertility adjustments based on sap analysis. Here's an example of the microbial inoculant effect on wheat that we see. The left side wasn't treated, that was spring wheat, and then this other on the right, that's winter wheat, and the one on the right wasn't treated, but the one on the left was. So we feel it works. It definitely stimulates that rhizosphere. Okay, the last thing I'll just touch on is intensification, internal nutrient cycling. See, we haven't spent any money yet. We're just using our models here to make this all click. Rotation effect is the third leg, so to speak. And people call this, the new fancy words are legacy response, over-yielding, and soil priming. And that's what cover crops are good for, is the more we understand about the microbial communities, and that's all the new emerging science is like trying to contextualize the microbial communities that are associated with different cover crop mixes. So someday it'll be like, oh, I need to access phosphorus, so this is a really good mix, has like a really good track record. Or, you know, instead of it just being anecdotal responses that you observe, actually might be some actual decision making that can be done. So this is what the first 4 years of changing our rotation from a corn soybean kind of system to just bringing in the cereal crop. So when we think back to the time and space, and this was shown in another talk, is our solar economy stretches way out, and we're able to use our resources more effectively, and it's made a big difference on what our first year corn looks like in terms of after soybeans. It's just a stronger corn crop. And then if we put all the years into play now, and if we just look at county averages versus kind of a rough estimate of our averages. So we stack a lot of corns. And of course, early work was like, oh, second year corn, not so good. Third year corn, not so good. But we look at it as intensification. Now, 4 or 5 years of corn, not so good either, because now you don't have any diversity. But stacking is okay, and that's some trick I picked up from way back in the day. But I'm trying to show you here is you don't get too much penalty for intensifying by doubling up on corn. And being in the longer rotation, the first year corns, that's stronger because now some of that corn is following the cereal crop plus the cover crop. So that brought our average up above your corn soybean, which is emulated by the county averages. Now Lincoln County's got a wide range. We're on the highly variable dry side, so to speak, whereas part of Lincoln County is more stable, has a little higher yield outcome. But again, we're running par there, and we're beating the area we farm in South Dakota pretty handedly. Not that that's what it's all about, but it's showing that intensification does work. Again, first year corn, or multiple year corn's pretty close. Soybeans, this is where it's more exciting, and there's plenty of research to validate this, to support what we're seeing. The lab where I worked in Brookings, the long-term no-till experiment that I helped start, it's been through 6 4-year cycles. So you can't publish no-till research peer-reviewed unless it goes through 2 complete cycles, because it doesn't count as no-till. It's just rotational tillage, so they had to standardize that. But anyway, that study, they're showing tremendous gains in 4-year rotated soybean. That long break with 3 carbon crops, just tremendous advantage. And so we're seeing the benefits too on our soybeans. A lot of our soybeans, minimum of 2-year break. We have a lot of 3+ because we're stacking corns. We have our cereal crop component, so it's stretching out our rotation. And our soybeans are happy that we've done that. There's just some of the data. There's the old data that I always grabbed onto to intensify, and then here's some new data. So 35% higher soybean yield if you don't go corn soybean and just bring in a cycle of 4, and that's in no-till. So in 2024, 4 of our top 5 fields hadn't been soybeans for 5 or 6 years. And they're all conventional soybeans. And they were the most healthy, happy fields of soybeans you could grow. And there's no disease complex there. And that has a lot to do with any place they grow pulses. What's the first thing that train wrecks pulses? Chickpeas went down this path. You get field peas, same problem. They all get soil-borne fungal problems that they can't overcome. And it's the same with soybeans. We just tend to prop it up more with more intensive inputs. Whereas in the semi-arid, if you grow pulses, you can't put that many dollars to prop it up. And edible beans in North Dakota would be a similar scenario. Got to use a lot of things to kind of prop that system up. But just a long break goes a long ways to fixing those problems without spending any money. Just the last thing that is exciting to me, and that would be over-yielding, and so relay cropping. We've flirted with that. I think some of our neighbors are ahead of us on this, and that's okay. But again, it has to do with availability. This is just a little field of winter camelina. So our seed business, we buy winter camelina from a couple growers. I think we should grow more of this, but creates opportunities as far as efficient nutrient use. But again, intensification could be part of this over-yielding concept. And finally, diversification. That's the last piece of the puzzle. Kind of goes into play with rotation effect. So this, in the last 8 years, these are all the crops that Olsen Custom Farms has raised, either multiple years or maybe 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, and then rotate to something else, whether it's a market-driven decision or whatever. But you got to have diverse sets of products that you're going to raise to be competitive, but it also they enable you to do those other things. If these are just some of the examples. The very bottom scenario is the one that we need to get going. We just haven't tried it yet, but the other ones are fairly common for us. Oop. And the last, got to be a good observer. If you're not out looking at things and making observations and keeping records, then we can't take advantage of these free inputs or being prudent with the things that we're given. So collecting internal data, which I'm sure many people do, but we can always raise it to a higher bar, especially if you're grabbing onto a new management decision. So the photo on the left, we applied for a Minnesota AGRI grant so we could look at the effect of our compost when we had a composting operation and see if we could replace traditional P and K fertilizer. And so we monitored, things like soil moisture, soil temperature, nothing that's too expensive. And soil moisture tools, people that use irrigation, they're familiar with them, but if you need that extra little vote of confidence on termination of covers, and again, looking at, well, what's my moisture scenario looking like through the year? Using sensor technology, that's not a bad idea for a low cost to just give you better than just your gut. Then you can track that through time, and it'll help you make better decisions on termination timing in the future. So collect a lot of internal data. A farm our size, it's hard to rope in and get good data a lot of times. We get a lot of data, but a lot of it's hard to make meaning of when you get to scale and you have lots of different people doing different tasks, versus if you have a smaller operation, you can generate really good data. Just like when I was in the research world, you just can control more variables. And I'll end there. I'm sure I'm over time, not too bad. That's the best way I like to crop scout on my bicycle. You're speed limited by how fit you are. So there's lots of things that I probably glossed over. Myself, I like to grow niche crops. I used to be a market grower for a few years. So I grew like cut flowers, familiar with like high tunnel production, different things like that too. But broad acre crops are kind of the world I live in these days. So I just play around with